All right. Welcome back, everyone. It's been a couple of weeks since Mary Ellen finished up with us. Excuse me. And it's been a couple of weeks since we've done Record Live, but we have come back on the airwaves today because we have a very special guest, Pastor Glenn Townend, who is the president of the South Pacific Division. Thanks for being with us today, Pastor Glenn.
Hey, good to be with you, Jared. Good to see you.
It's I think it's been 3 or so years already now that we've done these sort of end of year Record Live catch-ups for our audience, just to, I guess, talk a little bit about what happens at the end of year meetings. From my perspective, it's great to know some of the decisions that have been made, some of the ways the church works. Certainly I learn a bit more about how the church works each time we speak. And I think for our viewers, it's nice to get to know you a bit better as well, Glenn, and see some of the work that that your day-to-day entails. But I guess to start with, hopefully not too hard a question, but how are you? It's been a crazy sort of year, and you've had lots of meetings. This is meeting season, but how are you tracking with it all, and what does life look like at the moment?
Well, life looks like very much home. I'm in my home office. It's still there quite a bit. We've done some renovations and a refit in the office at 148 Fox Valley Road. I have been in there a couple of days, but they don't have all the furniture yet, so it's kind of easier working from home. And when I'm on a flat screen most of the day, it doesn't really matter where I am. So I have not really traveled anywhere beyond Wahroonga, the Central Coast where I live, and Cooranbong, Avondale for a very long time, since June.
That would be unusual for you, wouldn't it? Because
very unusual
in your role, and I guess in the past couple of roles that you've had as president of Western Australia is a massive region. TPUM has many different countries that it encompasses. And I suppose, how often would you say you would have traveled before the pandemic as opposed to now?
Look, at least twice a month. On average, I'd be on a plane somewhere or a car. But during all the lockdowns and that, I have been able to preach in Suva, and also do meetings in New Zealand and in Victoria, and all over the place, and continual contact with Papua New Guinea. So digital media really helps us. And for me, that has been good, that we've been able to keep in contact. It's not the same, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, it's really shrunk the world. It shows us how connected we can be. So to the meetings, Glenn, that we've recently held, it's been sort of end of year. Every November, it seems we have conversations like this because there's some sort of special meetings that happen around this time. Can you just tell us what they are and the sort of things that were covered this year?
Yeah, look, sure. So this year we had our major meetings in July, and that's where we chose a new secretary, Pastor Mike Securi, and a new treasurer, Mr. Francois Keat. That's where we renewed our executive committee, all the different committees that we run, and there's 80 or so of those, and there's nearly 300 different people involved in those. So that all happened at our quinquennial meetings, which were in July. So the ones in just last week were our first major set of meetings. We'd had a couple of boards, but there was a whole lot of committees all together. And we did have all of our annual general meetings from the various companies that we had, and they have to happen on a regular basis. And so we had all of those, and we did have a short executive committee as well.
Now, speaking of meetings and COVID and the disruptions that have happened, those meetings that you had in July, they were supposed to be last year, weren't they? Because of the quinquennial sort of cycle.
That's right. And the quinquennium is 5 years, so it should have been from 2015 to 2020. But yeah, the GC has been postponed, and that's how it kind of relates to the General Conference session. But they made an allowance for all the divisions could have their meetings earlier, not necessarily after the General Conference session. But that General Conference session will take place in June, early June next year. And it will happen virtually and in person. So in the past, it could only be in person, but they're having a special constituency meeting or session in January just to change the constitution to make that happen. And we have SPD reps going to that, but they all live around Washington, DC.
Okay, while we're on that, I understand that was one thing that was discussed at these recent meetings, was some of the, I guess, the parameters or the ways that GC session will be different and how SPD delegates will be able to interact with that. Is there any sort of thing you can tell us about how that's going to work for next year?
Well, up until this last division executive committee, we had said with all of the COVID transport, international transport bans and all of the lockdowns and restrictions that, look, we really couldn't go. Mm-hmm. But we've been in contact with our travel people that do our bookings and other people, and it's likely that some of us can go. Mm-hmm. And so we presented to the executive committee a number of scenarios that would try and get everybody there. But that is an impossibility because not every one of our delegates is double vaxxed, and they have to be. And there are some countries that still have not opened their borders in our part of the world, and their vaccination rates are really, really low. And it would be quite difficult to get a visa to go to the United States. So we know that not everybody will be able to go or would want to go. We know some people who are delegates but who are double vaxxed but are saying, oh no, the risks are too great. And so we said, all right, do we all stay? Do we all go, or do we do a mix in between? And the end result, it wasn't unanimous, but it was a very strong majority, is that we would take up to 50 delegates, which is more than half, and go there in person, and the others can be involved in the Zoom, because we just know some people can't go. And like in Papua New Guinea at the moment, they can actually get there via airlines, but they have to get travel insurance based in Papua New Guinea from Papua New Guinean companies, and at the moment we haven't been able to find one that will actually insure people. So there's some of the obstacles that we're kind of working through, and yeah, so hopefully there will be some of us there. And yeah, but you know, who knows? There might be a Zeta strain, and it'll be worse than the Delta strain. And you know, the good thing is that one of the things I've noticed, although it is really quite stressful, our pastors, our teachers, our medical people, the people that, you know, work in all the different entities, the flexibility, the adaptability, the resilience in dealing with all of this has been really shown through. Now, some are a little tired, and I can understand that. I am as well, even though I'm not traveling. There is a lot more meetings, and yeah, the flat screen is not the same as face to face, and so yeah, look, I'm looking forward to more face to face meetings for us in this division, but also for the general conference. So yeah, anyway, that was the decision.
I guess if there's anything that this pandemic has taught us, it's to expect the unexpected, or to it's hard to plan sort of ahead. I think a lot of people have put many plans on the back burner in these past few years. One thing that interests me as a leader, Glenn, what you've seen through the church, you've mentioned that we're on a lot more meetings and we're doing Zoom, and obviously evangelism's happening in that space. We're still preaching and teaching, and we're able to interact with different people around the globe. What are some sort of pros and cons that you've seen as a leader in these spaces, with having some of the meetings virtually, with having as opposed to being face to face? There's probably drawbacks, but there's also some positive things.
Yeah, look, the positive things is that we have been able to remain connected as a very diverse division, and I think that's really really important. We have learnt a lot about digital media and digital evangelism, and we have discovered that the live streams and the different worship services and evangelistic things that we've done have reached a whole lot more people, but we don't have contact with them. So the reach has expanded, but there's been less contact, and so that's kind of been one of the things that we've learned. Two things that another two things that we highlighted at our very short year-end meetings was, one, that the South Pacific Division at annual council topped the figures twice, and in really two significant areas. One is we were the only division that grew significantly in number. And we had, I think it was 49,000 baptisms last year in the pandemic. That's a lot of people. So we grew, and the General Conference has asked us, why were you the only division that grew? Well, our neighbours based in the Philippines, Southern Asia, I think they grew by less than 1%, where our growth was 4 or 5%. Two major things. In the Trans-Pacific Union, where they had big growth, they've followed a cycle of what they call the harvest cycle of disciple making. And they just follow it all the time. You've got to prepare the soil before you sow the seed. And when you sow the seed, you've got to cultivate the plant. And then when you cultivate the plant, you've got to actually harvest it. And then when you harvest, you've got to multiply and do it all over again. And that teaching is ingrained in the Trans-Pacific Union churches. And so they were out there doing good things, preparing the soil. They were still doing Bible studies and witness, whatever within the restrictions of the lockdowns in the various countries. And a lot of the pastors and lay people still did Bible studies on Zoom and evangelistic programs through Hope Channel and whatever. And so they just kept doing it, but they just did it differently. And, we're able to meet in small groups. And so that was the major reason that the Trans-Pacific Union grew significantly. And the Papua New Guinea Union also grew, same kind of thing. But their lockdowns never stopped groups meeting. But instead of having, churches, and there are some churches there, are quite significant in size, many hundreds, thousands, and whatever. And the lockdowns at various stages limited it to 10 people, 20 people, and 50 people. And what happened is that the people all just met in that number of groups. And in those groups, we had been teaching, the harvest cycle of evangelism as well, but also the discovery Bible reading and getting out the World Changer Bibles, both in TQM and PNG, right across. And the people just followed that, and they just saw people coming, their neighbours, their friends, and they just, some former Adventist and whatever, and they just said all of that training in discovery Bible reading, the World Changer Bibles, was what helped as they grew. So that was exciting because Australia and New Zealand didn't see that growth, but there was so much growth in the other two unions that we were kind of, and yes, the General Conference, we're doing a study for them right now, saying, how come you're able to do that and see what we can learn for other parts of the world. The second area where we were noted was the General Conference does a use of tithe report, because tithe is sacred. It's the 10% that belongs to God, and we acknowledge his sovereignty and his goodness to us from returning that tithe. And we have made a policy that 55% of tithe needs to go to evangelism and pastoral ministry.
Yes.
And then, 3% to education, and then the rest can be administration and departments. Well, our division, I think, recorded 56% going to pastoral ministry and evangelism, which was the highest for any of the divisions. Some were as low as 30% for pastors and evangelism, and had far more on departments and administration and education, and so Australia and New Zealand were the two unions that helped there, because they even have nearly percentages up in the 60s, so that we try and run a leaner administration and support so that we can get as many pastors on the front line where it really matters. And so, that's encouraging. God's leading us, and we're trying to do our best. And I think it's working sometimes, and we thank God for that.
I mean, it surely shows God's providence, his leading in that it's been such a rough sort of couple of years, but there's still been that blessing, that multiplication that we've seen. And I guess the other thing that's interesting, it seems like what you're saying is that much of that groundwork was prepared before the pandemic hit. And we believe that God knows, the future, and he guides us and he leads us in ways where we would not know. We look in hindsight and we see his hand moving in those spaces. And I guess it's really clear in those two examples, those two highlights that have come out of some of these meetings, that God was planting those seeds in our church, in us, before the pandemic hit, so that people were able to respond there.
And,
that's really encouraging.
And it's interesting that certainly the people in Papua New Guinea and the Trans-Pacific, that's what they say. God prepared us. We didn't know, but he did.
Yes.
And I think in the same in Australia and New Zealand, where our media reach has exploded exponentially as well, that most of our churches had people that could help, with Facebook Live or YouTube or, whatever form that they did their electronic media, and that reach expanded as well. And I suspect when things open up a little more, we will see the results in Australia and New Zealand. Now, just recently, Pastor Gary Webster, who is president of Tasmania, but he's also the Institute of Public Evangelism's director, and that's a division function. And in that capacity, he went to Perth about a month ago, probably 6 weeks now. 3 churches. All they did was, have a good, healthy church, as well as social, digital marketing and advertising. And he got really good numbers out.
Wow.
And there are over 50 or so people in Bible seminars and follow-up and Bible studies, and about 12 or so people for baptism, and made those decisions. And Gary was saying, we haven't seen those kind of numbers for a long time with such a small spend. And he and I and a whole lot of others, leaders are saying, well, if it opens up, and if we can be smart with our advertising and that, we may be able to capitalize on all of those who have been watching online and say, hey, come face to face. Now that could be a big step, but he believes that it worked. And well, it certainly worked in these 3 churches in Perth recently.
And we've certainly noticed that Philip made the comment on watching along on YouTube. 70 churches in Australia have FM radio stations operating, and 15 of those in WA. I was just editing a story from John in Fiji, John Tosseria, about some of the impact that Hope Channel television and radio making over there. And so, yeah, you do see in different countries it's different, whether it's Hope Channel New Zealand or some of the television in the islands, or here in Australia with the radio work and the other things that we do. There are things that have been prepared beforehand. Philip also asked a question, and I think this is probably more for our AUC brethren. We might get Terry or someone on to see how the restructure conversations are going. But I think, certainly in comparison, it does seem like the SPD is making a real effort to pour into the grassroots, is what you're saying, with the tithing, where those appropriations are going and how they're being used. And I think that's encouraging for us to prioritize mission over administration, I guess. And that's a positive thing.
So look, I do know that the possible restructure is still on the Australian Union Conference agenda. It is also on the Papua New Guinea Union agenda. It's also on the TPUM agenda, and NZPUC. So all of them are talking about it. And TPUM and New Zealand Pacific, so Trans-Pacific New Zealand Pacific, did a restructure and reduced administration, I think it was around 2012. Because because when I went out there was 2013 and it had already happened. And we did a review of that, which was presented to the executive committee just last week.
Yes.
And there's been some good things out of it, but it's now time to review, and there's been some challenges. And so we're actually working with those two unions to help them work through some of the challenges. And those that did the review have got a few recommendations that we can help and support. That some of the administrations, for example, only have a president. And in a sense, he's a bit of a lone leader and needs a little bit more support. So we have to try and think about how we can encourage senior pastors, the executive, and how all that works to get support just for a one person administration. And that happens in a number of missions in New Zealand, Pacific, and also in TPUM. So, yeah, they've kind of led the way. Papua New Guinea is looking at it at the moment, and so too is Australia. So, yeah, it's important.
So yeah, you mentioned
yeah.
You mentioned that, the TPUM had that review, and that was, I guess, looked at during these past meetings. Were there any resolutions or any decisions, or was it more of just an update on how that went? And
yeah, no, look, we need to make some changes. When you're leading and you're the only one who's leading in administration and you don't have support, that's tough. And so we need to find some support, and how we do that, we're going to be working, the division and those unions will be working together early next year. There was some recommendations where we'll follow the different recommendations and trial some in various places.
What were some of the other I guess highlights for you that came out of, or just things that are of note out of some of the last few weeks?
We've got a new committee or new committees.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you have new committees, there's a freshness,
Mm-hmm.
there's enthusiasm, there's different ideas and perspectives. And so, that was one of the highlights for me, getting to know some new people and appreciating the skills and abilities, experiences that God has given them, and how they can use them to contribute to whatever He's called them to. That was really good.
What was the sort of did you get any feedback or hear from some new people? I guess there's an orientation period, and some of that may have had to happen this year because it's early in the quinquennium. Some of these new delegates who are just experiencing these kinds of meetings, hearing some of these things perhaps from the inside for the first time. What sort of feedback, or what do you hear from those folk who are starting this process fresh?
Yeah, usually it's, wow, we never realized the church was so big and so well organized and operates in so many different diverse areas, and what that actually means. I mean, I think, we've got PAU, Pacific Adventist University, we've got Avondale University, we've got Adventist Media, we've got the Sydney Adventist Hospital, we've got Sanitarian Wellbeing Group, then we've got the conferences and the unions and the division, and then in the division we've got risk management services and IT, services, and a facility to deal with funds, and they just they kind of know it. But then when they kind of see it and they have to be involved in the organisation and the running and the governance of it all, they kind of go, oh, wow. This is big. This is complex. This is not easy. We are a really diverse, a diverse division with all of these services. But then all of these services apply to these, so many different countries with so many different cultures. And for some people, they haven't worked with other cultures a lot. And so they kind of, wow, that's new for them as well. So, it's a little bit of a kind of they're seeing all of the good and the big and the complexity, early stages. Some who've been around, are kind of, the more that the people understand, the more they can challenge and contribute and hold, the different companies and executives and boards to accountability. And that's what we want. That's what the whole purpose of the governance and the meetings is about.
And as part of that process, you mentioned some of our institutions just now, and that they had their AGMs in recent times. Are there any sort of institutions or anything that sort of you'd like to highlight at this point that stood out from the past couple of weeks? Obviously, you've had a lot of reports and a lot of different things, but is there anything that sort of springs to mind that is worth sharing here?
Yeah, look, there certainly is for all of them, and I'll start with Adventist Media, which you're a part of. The thing that Adventist Media has done that nobody else that we're aware of in the world in Adventism has done is taking people from a media or, iPhone computer experience to face-to-face interaction on a regular basis. And that has happened through Mums at the Table. And that started off as a television program and then went to Facebook and has kind of morphed now into Mums at the Table groups that are starting up all over, a bigger reach, and they're starting up all over the place. And I've got two daughters, and they both got young kids, but one of them was just, got a baby this year, and she's a part of one of these groups, and she was talking to, just this week, 3 other mums that she hardly knows, who said, we want to be involved we need a face-to-face, and we need support from Mums at the Table resources to help us in our parenting and all of that. And you kind of go, that's exciting. And it's exploding. So something that's digital is having an impact face-to-face, and people are willing to come and talk face-to-face. They're willing to come to groups at churches and schools. They're willing to be involved in Sabbath school and all the other church activities that we have for kids, younger kids. And that's the connection that we want for all that we do, I think. So,
for sure.
So that was Adventist Media. Sydney Adventist Hospital, real challenges like every hospital. Elective surgery limited, which is the bread and butter of the hospital, the Sydney Adventist Hospital. But the government, supported because it wanted us to be alert and ready for COVID. And certainly, there were COVID patients at different times and staff, and, having to work through all of that was a real challenge. But they maintained their ethos. And during this year, the cancer support services was recognised in Newsweek magazine, so the world global news magazine, as the SANS cancer support services is in the top 25 of the whole world.
Wow.
That's worth celebrating.
Yeah,
The
that's
care
huge.
and the focus and the research and all of that. So we've congratulated them. And yeah, that's a highlight there. Sanitarium, health and well-being.
Hmm.
Logistically, it's been a real challenge. Getting raw materials for the products, getting things shipped to various places, because I don't know if you know anything about it, but shipping containers, prices have skyrocketed, and people are just buying more online, and it has been a record-breaking year for them, despite the challenges, and in profits and in community contribution has
Wow.
been, both have significantly, they've raised the bar. And so you go, well done to, Sanitarium and all those involved in that. Avondale became a university this year. Highlights.
Yes.
They still haven't been able to celebrate it because, and that's going to be next year, because of all the lockdowns and all of that. And with that, students have not been on campus very much, certainly in the Lake Macquarie or Cooranbong campus. And so that has been quite a challenge. But the amazing thing is, projections of enrolment for next year are up.
Wow.
Despite, these challenges. And so, Avondale is great. Pacific Adventist University, they've had, a number of people associated with the university pass away because of COVID. It's a handful, but families, a husband or a wife of someone who works there, people living on campus, guest lecturers living in Port Moresby, and they're at one stage about 50% of, nearly 50% of students had COVID, and so there was some real challenges. And the government came and supported, and people were reluctant to have vaccination, but Professor Loie Matanayo, who is the new Vice Chancellor, he came from being Chief Scientist for Papua New Guinea to our Vice Chancellor. And he is just so good at explaining the science of vaccination. And so the angst, he's been able to just lower it and just keep going. But it has affected them. They can't have a graduation. Avondale can't have a graduation. And they've had to finish up classes and exams sooner than they normally would. But again, the staff really resilient. And so they're the highlights of the institutions. And then with, we have risk management, and they've been able to help insurance despite COVID, which has been amazing as well. And our cash management facilities have been able to keep our funds secure, although, you can't get any interest rate because it's really low. But, all of this is presented, talked about, and people say, hey, we've got quality people looking after these different services and organisations, and we do, no doubt about it.
One of the, and I'm not sure if this was part of the end of year meetings, but it was a sort of recent report that we had come across our desk, is some of the, I guess, expanded work of AdSafe. They're sort of doing more. They've been around for a little while, helping with Australia and New Zealand and the church there, especially through the Royal Commission sort of times into child abuse for institutions, and now there's some added functions, I guess, throughout the SPD. Can you just speak briefly to what AdSafe is doing in that space? Because I think that's really important work that needs to happen.
Good on you. Just this week, AdSafe are taking worships for the SPD, and they've been absolutely excellent. So, yes, we've expanded into the South Pacific. We have people in our office at 148 Fox Valley who their focus is the Pacific, but we have one person at Trans-Pacific Union, Mary, and we have Pastor and Dr. Benjamin and Agnes Kohler in Papua New Guinea. And the whole focus for the Pacific is child protection and vulnerable people protection. And so educating people on the safety of and how to care for children and vulnerable people appropriately, and how to build protective behaviours into churches, into just church members understanding, and particularly for children and the vulnerable as well. So that's their major focus in AdSafe in the Pacific. And yes, it's only just all of those appointments have happened in, say, the last 6 weeks. And they've started to make it happen in those places, which is exciting.
We're sort of running out of time for this afternoon, but is there anything else out of the meetings or recent sort of things that you'd like to highlight, or that you think is good for people to know?
I've done a lot of talking, Jared. I can't think of too much else. I would just say that we have been blessed. Financially as well. Our finances have not gone backwards. In fact, they've gone up. Tithe particularly. Offerings, not so good.
Yeah.
And if I was to encourage people, is be generous. Particularly not just, to your own local church. Obviously, that's important, because we've got to, support what we're doing locally. But the needs across the division and across the world are just huge. And so if we can be generous, if God's blessed you despite the challenges of the pandemic, I would encourage people to give. We had put aside a couple of $1 million. I can't remember the numbers. So I'm not the finance person, but I do know it was a significant amount to help if any of the conferences or missions, had a significant dip in giving and in tithe. And there's only been a couple of places that have needed some support. And that just says, wow. And as I said, some conferences and Tithe has gone up in the double digits.
Hmm.
And you say, hey, God's people are faithful despite the pandemic.
Well, as we wrap up, Glenn, what we like to do on Record Live is to sort of, it's often a practical program. We like to look at our own relationship and journey with God, and whatever important topics we're talking about, we try and bring that across. And I guess meetings, you're like, well, how do we do that? But I guess I wanted to ask you, while you're with us, if there's anything you've learnt, or if there's any sort of spiritual encouragement you can give us that's come out of the challenges of the past couple of years, something that's sort of been a lesson or a thing that God's been showing you and leading you in, that sort of we can be encouraged by in the midst of, as we start to recover from the pandemic and things start opening up a little bit. Hopefully we're getting back into churches face to face and that sort of thing. But is there something we can take away with us this week that's more on the spiritual or practical application side?
Sure. Look, I haven't had to travel so much in aircraft, well, not at all, nor in the car to the office back and forth. And so that has given me extra time.
Mm.
And I have generally put that extra time into reading. And this year, my focus has been on the Gospels and on Jesus, and reading a couple of books about the Gospels, including The Desire of Ages. And for me, it has just warmed my soul. I would say I love Jesus more now than I ever have because of that. And that's good for me. It is really good for me. And just this morning, one of the things that we've got to do as a church is report on outcomes and the impact that we're having. And it's interesting that Jesus in the judgment, what he did in coming to this earth as a baby, becoming one of us, giving up heaven, giving up his divinity, veiling it in humanity, being one with us, having to deal with the challenges of sin around him all the time, and death, and all the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the people and their expectations. Man, what he did was absolutely amazing, and that he chose to die. None of us can choose to die, but he chose to die, to take my sin and death, the two things I can't do anything about. I'm a sinner and I'm going to die. And Jesus dealt with that for me. That is just amazing. So that was his output. But in the judgment, the big thing is not so much of the great, glorious thing that Jesus did, which I think is the most significant thing of the whole universe. Absolutely. But in the judgment, he says, look at the transformed lives of my people. Look at the impact that they have made. They're feeding the hungry. They're clothing the naked. They're visiting those in prison. They're involved in their community to add value. Because that's what my gospel does. And it just kind of, wow, it just hit me today. Jesus, you're you should be, and we should be celebrating what you did, because we've got hope. And when it comes to the judgment, he says, no, it's what you did for the least of these, because what I did transformed you, and you made a difference. And that's the impact of the gospel. And so I just say, thank you, Jesus, and may I and our church be faithful in that impact of what Jesus has done. May others be able to see it in our community, because our purpose statement is to inspire hope in Jesus and the wholeness of life and the wellness of life. And yeah, so that was something that just came to me this morning when I was reading Matthew 25 and the parable of the sheep and the goats. I share that as an encouragement. Jesus is saying, it's not what I did that matters, it's what I did that had impact in other people's lives. That's what the judgment or the universe will see. So he's looking at the impact or the outcomes rather than his output. And I just go, Jesus, wow, that's amazing.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Glenn. May we all use this time, any extra time we have, to really marinate in the gospel and just, read it and take it in and find new insights each day this week for the rest of this week, until we see you guys again. So next week we have Karen Collum to talk about her new book about the Advent for kids. She's a teacher, an educator, a chaplain, and she's
and the book looks good. I just got a copy this week.
Oh, you've got your copy. That's good. We hope everyone out there is getting copies. It's good for sharing with families and sharing with kids. So
I've got grandkids that are going to get it.
They're going to get it. They're going to love it. That's good. So we'll talk to her next week and just more broadly about how we can pass our faith on to our children and that sort of thing. Very important conversation next week. So we hope you join us then. But Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you making the time and some of the insights and some of the updates from the meetings that you've been able to provide. It's a really good thing to be able to share with our people. So we appreciate that. So thanks a lot. And until next week, we'll see the rest of you then.
Bye.